Welcome to Privacy Abbreviated, brought to you by BBB National Programs. I am Dona Fraser, Senior Vice President of Privacy Initiatives at BBB National Programs. And I remain excited to discuss what's top of mind in the privacy space and hopefully to provide you with helpful information to prepare and operationalize your business, regardless of the size of your company. Today's discussion is, in my opinion, always a timely one. Every day, companies of all sizes are confronted with drafting, updating, and adhering to their online public-facing privacy policies. And regardless of whether consumers, visitors to your website are reading these long missives, they are necessary. Certainly required if you are collecting any information about your site visitors. I believe that my guest today is perfectly suited to discuss some of the issues around privacy policies. Full disclosure about my guest today, another good friend who I have known for many years and whom I have leaned on for advice for many years. So we know that he's a smarty. Wills Catling is Director of Privacy at Myna Partners, a boutique consulting firm specializing in privacy, compliance, and technology. At Myna, Wills leads teams of seasoned professionals in privacy strategy and AI governance, focusing on developing comprehensive privacy programs and implementing effective processes. Prior to joining Myna, Will served as a director at Promontory Financial Group, part of IBM Consulting, where he specialized in addressing regulatory and operational privacy challenges for global organizations. Additionally, Will spent 7.5 years at IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. We should all know what that acronym is if we're in this space. And they are the world's largest professional organization for privacy professionals. So welcome, Wills.
Thank you, Donna. Delighted to be here.
Well, we just learned before we recorded that this is your first podcast. So I'm so happy that this is your debut. I'm excited.
Let's see how that goes.
You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. So I want to level set a little and set some expectations for listeners about today's conversation, because we will not be telling you how to draft your privacy policy. There are hundreds of resources on how to do this, including Myna. They can help you with this. Instead, I think it's more important to discuss what do companies need to do first before actually drafting that policy. And please stop the copying and pasting of one that you found on the internet, because that just doesn't work, and it scares me that people are still doing that. But Wills, as I said earlier, we know every company with an online presence is collecting information about their site users or visitors, whatever phrase we want to use. They must have a privacy policy. However, before a company can get to that and through that exercise, they first must have some decisions and discussions about their internal governance to help guide that privacy policy process. So whether your company has 5 or 500 employees, there are some common elements that should be commonplace, with strong leadership and ethics, I think, being a given. So I think we could check those two off, right? That your organization has strong leadership and strong ethics. So my first question to you is risk management the next consideration? And if so, what should those conversations look like? If it's not risk management, what should be the next step?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Donna. I think all of the things you just said are critical considerations for any company. As you said, regardless of size, if they're handling user data or personal data, and they want to have responsible operations, then these are all critical considerations. And as you said, privacy policy or privacy notice, depending on what naming convention you want to use, it shouldn't be just a document, but it should be a reflection of the company's internal governance and decisions about handling personal information. So, as you said, is risk management the next consideration? What should those conversations look like? Yes, absolutely. After establishing the ethical foundations that we assume you have, and you've got leadership, commitment, or buy-in, risk management is the crucial next step. I always feel that before you can define policies, you need to understand the potential risks associated with I'll say more broadly processing, but that encompasses collecting, storing, using, sharing personal data. So, um, and so what would these conversations look like, or what should they look like? Identifying assets. What data are you collecting? What personal data? How is it stored? Is it sensitive? Who has access to it? Identifying threats. What internal and external threats could compromise the data? Cyber attacks, human errors, insider threats, etc. Then identifying vulnerabilities. What weaknesses are there in your systems or processes, or the human factors that could be exploited? Assess likelihood and impact for each identified risk. What's the probability of it occurring, and what would be the consequences should it occur? Whether that's financial, reputational, legal, or operational. And then one of the big factors is determining your risk appetite. How much risk is your company willing to accept? And we all know different companies have different risk appetites. And this is going to guide that next step of understanding what your mitigation strategies will be. And then obviously developing out those mitigation strategies, what controls, whether it's technical, administration, or administrative, physical, can be put in place to reduce the likelihood or impact of those risks. And from a privacy perspective, that could include encryption, access controls, employee training, etc. And then, one of the big things that we try and tell people is involve others from all teams, cross-functional teams. Don't just keep this conversation with IT and legal or your privacy team.
Yeah, you read my mind. That was my next
Yeah,
question. Who's at the table for these conversations, right?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, who are the people that are collecting the personal data? Who are the people that are using the personal data or processing the personal data? Bring product development, customer service, HR, especially marketing, into these conversations. This helps to ensure that holistic understanding of the risks and get buy-in for the mitigation efforts before you start down those roads. And then the good old regular reviews. It's like, we often say, this is not a one-time exercise. This isn't a do it and forget about it. This is absolutely something that needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. Technologies change, processes change, people change, etc., etc., and the threat landscape continues to change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So even in the smallest of companies, there has to be accountability for all of this. So what does that look like?
Yes, like rolling into accountability. It's essential. Whether you're a sole proprietor or whether you are, a Fortune 10 company, if you handle personal data without any form of accountability, policies and controls are just mere suggestions and serve no value. So I always like to think, I have seen through the years some amazingly written policies and procedures, that companies spend a lot of money drafting and spend a lot of time and they, in pull in outside assistance to do it. And they just get, filed away, the old fashioned put in a filing cabinet and left to rot. And it's like, if anything, that creates more liability. Again, just to be clear, not a lawyer, not legal advice. Talk to your legal team, talk to outside counsel. But you've now put in writing what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And then you've told nobody how to actually comply with those policies or procedures. So, what does accountability look like? I like to think of, and you'll hear this as if we're talking, kind of like I have like numbers of like 7 key elements of accountability. And I would say the first one is clearly defining roles and responsibilities. Who is responsible ultimately for data protection? Who is that individual or individuals or team? And who has ownership? Individuals or teams must own different or specific processes related to the handling of personal data. Making sure you've got reporting mechanisms set up. How are privacy-related issues or breaches reported out? To whom are they reported? What are the escalation paths that you've created? And then one of my favorites is having the metrics and the monitoring. It's so often you hear companies put processes in place, but if you don't have metrics and monitoring, how can you track adherence to your policies and the effectiveness of your controls? And then, unfortunately, you do have to have consequences for non-compliance. What happens if policies are violated? Um, this needs to be clear and it needs to be consistent. Whether it's disciplinary action for employees or whether it's termination of contractors or vendors, possibly. Um, Transparency, which I know we're going to come to in more detail as we get into the privacy notices, but again, being open and about how data is handled and who has responsibility will build trust with your users and your consumers, and can also help to foster that culture of accountability internally. And then documentation. Again, we tell companies all the time, keep documentation, keep logs, keep version controls, understand what actions have been taken. If you are doing, and you should be doing, training, identifying when it was completed, how many people have completed. And this, again, leads back into supporting those performance metrics and helping with that monitoring of your program.
So I think what I probably should say at the beginning, what we probably should have touched on a little bit, is the reality that these privacy notices, these public-facing documents, are essentially binding contracts between the company and the user, right? So again, we know we live in a world where most people don't read these things. However, they are important. Um, Regulators are looking at them when they decide to look at a company's efforts with regards to compliance. Um, and I think one of the things that we see, and I'm sure you've seen as well, is the simple fact of someone not being assigned to look at that complaint inbox. So every privacy notice has if you have questions, email us here. Well, who's checking that here box, right? I mean, I'm sure you've seen this go awry.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's, operationally, what would I say? A, define governance. B, build your policies and procedures. And part of that, create a RACI. It's fundamental stuff. And you can mature that as the program grows. Nobody expects you to, and I kind of warned you I would say this, but privacy program, it's like eating an elephant. It's like, how do you do it? It's one mouthful at a time. I just love that saying. And I think
It's a good visual too.
it is, and it's really what you should think about is, so often people who don't, or companies that don't have any kind of privacy program structure, and the policies and procedures don't exist, and they're starting on the journey, they panic, and it's like, how are we going to do all of this in 3 weeks? And it's like, you're not. It's like, we'll talk about it a bit more as we go through this, but it's like, once you've defined where your risks, like we talked about, where you've defined where your risks are and you understand what you need to do, you build that roadmap, you build that action plan, and you understand then where you are today and ultimately where you want to get to from a compliance perspective. And then it's, how do I get from point A to point B? And that's where you build the roadmap. And it potentially can take years. And as we said, it's an ongoing thing. It never ends. It's like, I'll use the old British analogy of painting the Forth Bridge, which is probably lost on everybody who's listening to this podcast. But it used to be this bridge in Scotland that they'd start painting it at one end. By the time they got to the other end, they'd have to go back to the beginning and start painting it all over again. And it was just a job for life. You were just painting the Forth Bridge. But privacy is a bit like that. It's like you can't ever accept that the journey is complete.
Right. Not with the landscape that we're in now, right?
No.
Especially in the regulatory landscape we're in now.
Yeah.
Especially for a global company that is trying to mitigate their risks with regards to state laws here in the U.S., federal laws outside the U.S., GDPR, whatever other laws that apply to what you're doing. It can get very complex, and people wonder why privacy policies are so lengthy, because companies do have to be rather specific about what they're doing, especially if they break it down by territory. So it can become problematic. I mean, I know that, and I think you and I have discussed this over the years about, short form privacy policies versus the long form privacy policy. And what does a short form privacy policy look like, right? What do consumers want to know, right? I think we could agree that consumers want to know, like, what information is collected, who is it being shared with, and the why, right? And the why is what connects the dots. If users understand why their data is being collected, they're more likely to opt in or agree to share their information with you, provided that that why also makes sense and that you've explained it well, right? So I want to go back a little bit to accountability. And we often hear people talk about companies used to have internal controls. Are accountability and internal controls the same thing, or are they interconnected? What's the difference? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. No, not the same thing, despite the fact some people would like them to be, I'm sure.
Yes.
But they are closely related and they are
Right.
definitely interdependent, as you said. Internal controls, I always think of these as specific mechanisms, rules, or procedures that you implement to ensure the integrity and compliance within your program. In the context of data privacy, internal controls are the practical measures taken to protect data and comply with your policies. Things like password policies, access restrictions, data minimization procedures, encryption, etc. And accountability, this is about assigning the responsibility and the ownership for the development and the implementation,
Right.
monitoring, and the enforcement of those internal controls and overall data protection practices. It's about who is answerable if something goes wrong or if controls are not followed. And I always like to, as I said, I love my fourth bridge and my eat an elephant one bite at a time analogies. So, differences illustrated. An internal control might be a policy stating that sensitive data must be encrypted at rest. Accountability means that a specific individual or team is responsible for ensuring the encryption is implemented correctly, that it's regularly audited or assessed, and that there are consequences if the control is bypassed without authorization. You can have internal controls without clear accountability. For example, as I said, with the policies in the filing cabinet, a policy exists, but no one's checking or following it. That's just ineffective. You can't have true accountability, though, without internal controls, as there's just
Right.
nothing concrete for which individuals are being held responsible.
Right.
Um,
Right. So what does obviously, look, our listeners range from the very small companies to the very large companies. And obviously for those very small companies, those startups, they're wearing multiple hats. But I think this information is helpful as you grow your company. These are the considerations that you need to make. Um, but when you get to the point of being a company where internal training is necessary, right? Because you're handling so much data. There's so much going on. The risks of getting something wrong are maybe it's not even a if, it's a when, right? We always talk about data breaches. It's not a matter of if, it's when. But what should internal training and compliance look like for these more established companies?
Yeah, internal training, it's always a challenge. But internal training and compliance programs are, again, in my opinion, vital for embedding a culture of privacy, information, or data security, data protection within an organization. When thinking about internal training and what should it look like, usually we recommend tailoring it to the roles. Training shouldn't be a one size fits all. Employees in different roles, like we said, marketing, HR, IT, etc., they're all going to interact differently with the data, and they should and they need training specific to the responsibilities and the type of data that they are handling. So, training should cover, some key concepts, I always think. This is a bit rudimentary or fundamental, but what constitutes personal information or sensitive data? We've seen, over and over again when we meet with individuals who are not privacy first, that their understanding of what personal information is or personal data is doesn't line up with what regulators or regulations define as personal data. Understanding what are the company's privacy policies and procedures. Again, filing them in a drawer, they're totally ineffective. What are the applicable data laws and regulations that your organization has to comply with? Understanding data privacy best practices, things like data minimization, purpose limitations, and how do you implement them across the organization and what do they mean? Because again, we often see organizations will, when you're doing something like a data mapping exercise, and you ask them what data that they use for the process, and when you get the answer, the question is, do you really need all of that data for that process? And it's like, well, probably not. It's like, well, then why do you ask for it? Nobody's ever asked that question. It was just, well, there's a field there, so let's get the date of birth and the birthday and the marital status, when it's completely has no relevance to that, and it's not proportionate for that processing activity.
Right. I mean, the days of drafting privacy policies and notices that talk about, we may do this, we may do that, and leaving the drawer open to collect as much information as you want and just having it sitting somewhere. Nobody knows exactly what you have, how much of it you have, what you're doing with it, how long you've held it. Those days are long, long gone. I think regulators and you and I have talked about this as well, that we're looking for these policy notices to be affirmative statements about what you are doing as well as what you're not doing. Because saying what you are doing doesn't necessarily exclude all that you're not doing either. Okay, so anything else you wanted to add on internal
I mean, you touched on it, incidents, it's not, unfortunately, if, it tends to be more when. So understanding how to recognize when there may have been a potential incident or a breach, and then how do you, what's the path to report that? And in today's world where data subject rights or individual consumer rights are far more prevalent, we've got now 20 US state laws if you include Florida. I know that doesn't include the federal laws, and then you've obviously got the global laws. So, the chances that you're going to be completely exempt or not have to comply with any data subject rights is probably diminishing by the day. So understanding how to handle a data subject request, how does that get escalated within the organization? Like you said, so many companies have that wonderful email, email at insert name of company here.com, so that we don't, and who monitors it? Is it an individual? Which means I've seen companies where that individual, either maybe not even at the company anymore, so nobody knows the mailbox isn't being monitored, or that individual, like everybody does, goes out on PTO or is out sick for a period of time. And it's like, so what? So suddenly somebody discovers this mailbox with 6 months worth of unanswered requests. Now, some of them may not need to be answered; they may be junk, but it's just, again, you're taking a liability, or you're increasing your liability for non-compliance.
So now you're ready to draft that pesky online privacy notice. So as I said earlier, and it is full of tips on how to do that. We're not going to talk about that. But what I do think would be really helpful and most interesting, considering all that you've seen over the years, is the mistakes that you've encountered, not necessarily the do's, but the don'ts. So I'd be interested to hear some of the don't do this, or the things that people just need to just be aware of.
Yes, I mean, I think you said one at the beginning where you said, do not go online and cut and paste somebody else's privacy notice. I've even seen those to the point where whoever cut and pasted it clearly didn't read it because it had the other company's
The other
name
company's
still
name in
embedded.
it.
So it's like you're like company one, and in
Right.
the privacy notice it says company two does not
Right.
do anything. That's not going to take anybody long to realize that this is not your privacy notice, and you cut and
I've
pasted
seen
it.
it where it's actually like a direct competitor, right? With, which I find just so
Maybe
fascinating.
you have exactly the same data processing activities. Maybe
Right. That's
you
right.
use the data exactly the same way, and
That's
you
right.
share it with the same individuals. So,
That's right. That's right.
but
That's right.
yeah,
Right.
it's
Or it's purely aspirational on your part.
yeah,
Um
and it's not difficult, like you said. I mean, there's so many resources out there, whether it's consultants like us or whether it's going to regulators. There are many resources out there to do it correctly. So on the don'ts, I thought about this last night after you reached out to me, and I kind of put together 6 don'ts on a privacy
Ooh,
notice. Ooh,
nice.
I know. Um, it's
Drum
like the
roll,
old it's
please.
drum roll. It's like the old 10 things to know about a data breach. One, it's going to happen.
Exactly
Probably,
right.
yeah, yes. The first one: don't use overly legalistic or vague language, like you were saying. Be clear and be concise. Don't bury the key information or make it hard to find. Um, if you, you know, if you do offer and have to offer or provide data subject rights to consumers, make it easy for them to identify where to do that and how to do that. Don't forget to update it regularly. Again, most regulations nowadays require a date of last update. So again, it's not difficult for anybody to look and see when you last updated your privacy notice. We recommend to organizations, have a procedure that's defined and documented, and responsible and accountable individuals for that procedure, and at least once a year review your privacy notice to make sure it's still accurate and that it does or does not need updating, and then obviously update it accordingly. Again, don't make promises you can't keep.
That's a big one. Well, so let's pause there for a second. That's a big one.
Yeah.
That's a really big one because I think um again, this goes back to the earlier part of our conversation about making sure that the right people are in the room
Mm-hmm.
for the conversations
Yeah.
about what you're collecting, who's touching it, what needs to happen with it. Um, and that can lead to, I think, making false promises, right? About what you're doing or want to do or plan to do or whatever it is.
Mm,
But I think that that's a fairly big one. And I think that that's what trips up a lot of companies.
yeah. I
That's,
think again, as I said, not a lawyer, not legal advice, but my legal friends have always said to me, do what you say and say what you do on a privacy notice. To your point, don't fail to disclose all data collection uses, sharing, and now with some of the new US regulations, state regulations, making sure that you're clear on your third parties, um, and don't neglect user rights and how to exercise them, like I was saying previously.
those are all very good ones, very important. All right, so you and I, and again, upholding your promises, because again, this is not just a contract, but it also is about how are you how are you as a company building that trust with your consumer, especially if you're a website that is actually doing purchases, right? It's one thing if you're a website where there may not be an actual purchase. But if you are an e-commerce website, your privacy policy statement re- really is going to be scrutinized when something goes wrong with regards to the data you collected, right? So if I'm on your e-commerce website and I don't want you to share my data, and you said that you will not share my data when I check this box, and I find that you're sharing my data, you're selling my data. Um, that's a huge violation, of at least under one state we know of. um, so I think it's just really important to, as you said, do what you say you're going to do, and that shouldn't be hard if all the other steps are followed.
Yeah, yeah. It's it's the building that roadmap. It's defining your policies and procedures. It's going through. I hate to harp back onto data mapping, but you and I talk about this regularly. You know, can you have an accurate privacy notice if you haven't recently updated your data maps? You can, but it's a lot of work. Probably, you know, probably Probably not. To be honest, it's like you need to do the data mapping so that you can understand what data you're collecting, when you're collecting it, how you're collecting it, why you're collecting it, all those points that are going to go into your privacy notice. And then it's also taking a look at your privacy program. Back when GDPR came into effect, it seems like forever, ever and ever ago. I feel like I was riding a horse and buggy to work back then, but it was only 7 years ago. Crikey, I know. And you take the 2 years previously, where most companies were trying to implement programs to comply, and you started a lot of those exercises with a privacy program assessment, so you'd understand against the controls that an organization needed to consider to be compliant, where did their program sit, and that helped build that roadmap. And privacy notices were a huge part of that, understanding how can you be transparent, how can you be fair, how are you being held accountable for what you do. And we're starting to see organizations realize that, again, they need to reassess their programs now, because it's not just the GDPR, it's GDPR plus, and insert number here depending on how broadly your company has to comply with different regulations across the US and the globe. So if you don't know where you are, how do you know where you're gonna, how can you get to where you want to get to?
Uh-huh.
And I think that comes up with the privacy notices. It's like, how can they be accurate if you don't know what you're doing as an organization?
Something else that you and I have discussed ad nauseum is opt in versus opt out. I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that in the US, we are traditionally opt out, and across the rest of the world, or at least in Europe, an opt in regime. I mean, I'd be curious to know where you kind of land on this, especially in the US. Are we transitioning to an opt in? I don't know how global companies navigate this, um, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes. As you said, GDPR and other similar regulations around the world tend to be predominantly opt in, not opt out. Whereas the US tends to be predominantly opt out, not opt in. There obviously are exceptions to that when it comes to things like sensitive personal information, or protected classes like children, which is dear to your heart.
Yes. I think the underlying premise regarding this, though, um, before you continue, is about giving who has control, right? Giving the user control over how their data is being used or not being used. Um, and each model has different parameters, but I want to make sure people understand that that's really what this is about, is control.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, opt in, as you said, is more user centric, but can present a higher barrier for data collection, um, as opposed to opt out, which is often easier for businesses but offers less user control. The trend does seem to be moving towards stronger opt-in requirements. Just as you say, a lot of companies are global, and have decided to not build a program geo-fenced, but complying at a global level. And also, some of it is just demand from consumers. It's um, you're seeing consumers understand more now what is going on with their data and wanting to have greater control over their data. So um, we are seeing companies move towards um, you know a stronger opt-in requirement.
I have visuals, so much like your very good analogy about eating an elephant. um, For me, I have this visualization in my head when I think about an opt out regime. To me, it looks like a mosh pit or like a Taylor Swift concert, whereas opt in looks like a classical music concerto that you would attend, where everyone's just we're sitting in our seats and no one's leaving their seats and we're just right here.
I like that.
Um,
And I also remember being at a conference many years ago when somebody once said that in the US, predominantly, you can do what you want with the data unless there's a law regulation that says you can't. Whereas in Europe and other similar jurisdictions, from a privacy regulation, you can't do anything with the data unless the law says you can. And it's that different construct of as a European myself, um, uh, you know, it's that fundamental right, and it's my data, and you are a custodian of my data, and therefore I should retain control of it. Whereas in the US, companies often, I feel, look at it as it's our data, and that's slowly changing, but there's still different perspectives on that, I think.
and I think it's changing due to a combination of things. The laws, some of the laws are requiring to change, but I do think that consumers are becoming more savvy about this. I think they're becoming possibly frustrated, but definitely more informed and educated about their options. And this may lead us down that dreaded path of the cookies, because weren't cookies supposed to just be going away?
Yeah, that's not happening. Um,
Right.
yeah, at least it doesn't seem to be
It doesn't
anytime
seem to
soon.
be happening anytime soon.
No.
So we're still faced with cookie banners. And do do they work? In your opinion, what is what is a good what should a good cookie banner look like?
Crikey. Um,
When I go to a website, I get a
yeah,
little unnerved when I see a cookie banner that says accept all or reject all, because I don't think, or ones that just say accept all
that's the
and
ones
that's
that,
it.
yeah, and I know California's changing that,
Yes,
and
because
requiring
that's
that
not a
if,
choice.
yeah, I guess, cookies are here. I mean, at the moment, cookies are here to stay, aren't they? But companies have to get it right. I mean, in your privacy notice policy, uh, you should clearly explain cookie usage, what types are being used, their purpose, the duration, and how users can manage those preferences. The cookie banner um, is, again, some companies are just applying it across the US. Doesn't matter where you go in, they're just going to fire the cookie banner at you. Others are geolocating it, so they're basing it on where do you access their website from, um,
Mhm.
and then what does that state have for requirements. You know, so if you sit in Massachusetts, you quite possibly won't get a cookie banner up here. But if you reside in New Hampshire or Colorado, etc., California, you're going to get a cookie banner appear when you go in. Um,
Do you think that obtaining informed consent is one of the bigger challenges facing companies these days? And because there's so many layers to it, but there's also so many reasons now, more so than ever, that companies actually need that informed consent, right? We talked about, just in time notices. So I'd rather, when I'm actually filling out that form online, tell me at that moment what you're doing with my data, as opposed to, this blanket statement that is buried in a privacy policy that I personally, yes, I'm going to read it. But the average user is not.
Yeah, obtaining informed consent is absolutely a major challenge in the environment we're in today, due to the complex data flows, different user interfaces, as you were saying, design limitations, consent fatigue, like we were just talking about, and the difficulty of explaining a lot of those technical practices in simple terms means that it really is a major challenge. To collect that and to record it accurately. But technology is out there that is helping organizations do that. We do a lot of work with organizations, helping them to understand how to address that challenge. But it's not an easy process, and it's not something that you can just flick a switch and you're suddenly able to comply with that. Uh,
Yeah. So, all right. Last question before I let you go. You are a CPO at a company, Wills. Don't forget the little people. Um, what would be, for you, what would be the most pressing thing about ensuring that your privacy policy, that you got it right?
if I was responsible for drafting privacy policies as a CPO, what would it look like? Um, I would say what I've seen from organizations out there, a layered approach, I think, and a user centric approach is the way I would want my organization to build its privacy notices. Um, Layer one is that quick overview. And I know you and I have discussed this before, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, that gives kind of a brief, plain language summary of the most critical points around, what data is collected, why it's collected, what are the key rights, and that it's easily digestible. So the layer two is a detailed policy, full comprehensive policy with all the necessary details, clearly organized with headings, and still written as clearly as possible. I always think that when I see a privacy policy, that second layer, the detailed policy, if it has a table of contents, if it has hyperlinks, yeah, it's like that helps. That helps an individual understand, and go to the sections that they particularly want to go to and read, as opposed to scrolling down pages and pages and pages and pages till they, and losing the will to live. And then focusing on clarity and actionability, not just making it about providing information, but providing understandable information that empowers the end user to make choices and exercise their rights. Try to avoid information overload if possible in the initial view, but ensure that the comprehensive details are covered and are accessible in the layer two, the detailed policy. Ultimately, the goal is to be transparent and give the user control, and not just to provide legal compliance through the density of the privacy notice or policy.
Yes, transparency, I think at the end of the day, is key to all this, right? And it's transparency that builds trust. Wills, thank you so much. I'm glad. I hope your first podcast experience was a good one.
Oh, it was lovely.
Safe space. It's a safe space.
Yes,
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I truly do appreciate you. And thanks to our listeners for listening to us today. As always, if you missed any of our previous episodes or you simply could not get enough of us on this one, please make your way over to accountabilitystudios.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. We really do want to get your feedback, so please leave us a review. Be kind, please. And feel free to make suggestions for topics you would like to hear us cover. Again, thank you, Wills Catling, and have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are in this big world. Thank you.